Imagine it is the year 1860. The soft light of a new day is just beginning to paint the sky, a gentle glow spreading across the horizon. The very first gentle rays of morning sun touch the ancient weathered stones of a quiet monastery, making them shimmer softly. This holy place sits peacefully near the great city of Constantinople, a city known for its incredibly long and complex history, a true crossroads of civilizations. Inside, the monastery is still deeply wrapped in the quiet hush of dawn, a profound silence that speaks of centuries of prayer. The peaceful sounds of morning prayers, sung in low, soft voices by the devoted nuns, have only just faded away, leaving echoes in the stone halls. A deep sense of calm fills the air, a spiritual quiet that has been a part of this sacred place for hundreds of years, a constant presence. But suddenly, this deep peace, so cherished and fragile, is violently broken. A new, harsh sound rips through the morning air, tearing apart the silence of the dawn. The heavy, thumping boots of many men approach the monastery gates, growing louder with every single step, signaling a dangerous arrival. Then, loud, rough shouts can be heard, words spoken in the Turkish language, full of anger, harsh commands, and a clear threat. For a young nun, inside these sacred walls, her simple world is about to shatter into countless pieces. Her life, once filled with deep prayer, quiet service, and gentle reflection, is about to be violently torn apart by an unimaginable force. She has known only devotion and the peaceful rhythm of monastic life, but now a terrifying darkness is closing in around her, threatening everything. In just a few short minutes, this young woman, filled with faith and innocence, will face a living nightmare. It is a horror that history, for a very long time, has tried very hard to keep hidden from the world. A secret birth by deep. This is a chilling and terrible secret from the powerful Ottoman Empire, a planned terror aimed specifically and cruelly at women of faith. This dark history, full of unspeakable acts, was kept quiet, carefully buried for hundreds of years, almost completely lost to time and memory. But we must ask ourselves a very important question, a question that demands an answer. Why were these women, these holy nuns, specifically chosen as targets above all others? What made them so special, so important, in the eyes of their brutal attackers? What dark, cruel system turned their deep religious devotion, their profound spiritual connection, into something bought and sold like a common item? How did their unwavering faith become a mere possession, like an object to be owned and traded, its value stripped away? Before we continue this journey into a forgotten past, a past filled with pain and shocking truths, I need your help to tell these stories. Have you ever felt a sudden, deep sense of dread, a cold knot tightening in your stomach like a warning sign? A strong, unsettling feeling that something truly terrible was about to happen to you or someone you loved? A shadow falling over your spirit? Tell us about it in the comments below. Share your experiences with the unknown. Your personal stories help us understand the human side of history, how people felt during these intense and terrifying moments. Please help me reach 1,000 subscribers so more people can learn about these hidden truths. By simply hitting the subscribe button and liking this video right now, you become a vital part of our mission, a partner in uncovering history. You help us keep exposing history's darkest and most important secrets, ensuring these untold stories are never forgotten, never silenced again. The year is indeed 1860, and the world is on the edge of major, often violent changes. Empires are rising and falling, and new ideas are clashing with old traditions. Picture that young nun once more. Her heart is pure, filled with goodness, kindness, and a deep sense of purpose. Her entire life has been lovingly dedicated to God, to serving her faith, and to caring for her community, a path chosen with deep conviction. Her monastery, with its thick stone walls, quiet courtyards, and ancient archways, was more than just a building, more than a simple dwelling. It was a place of deep, silent reflection, a true haven of peace for both body and soul. It stood as a calm island in a world that was often busy, loud, and full of danger, a sanctuary for prayer, spiritual growth, and quiet contemplation. But that peace, so carefully built, so tenderly cherished, was terribly fragile, almost like a delicate dream. It was like thin, delicate glass, ready to shatter into 1,000 tiny pieces with the slightest shock, the smallest tremor. Ottoman soldiers, fierce and unyielding in their resolve, were now closing in on her sacred home, their presence a dark cloud. Their approaching presence felt like a dark, heavy storm cloud, gathering immense strength and about to break with terrifying destructive force, bringing chaos. Her quiet world, a life carefully woven with daily prayers, simple tasks, and selfless service, was about to be utterly destroyed. The gentle rhythm of her days, the sacred routines she held dear, would be ripped away without mercy. Everything she knew, everything she held dear, would be gone in mere minutes, erased from existence. The change would be swift, brutal, and complete, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. This kind of attack, this sudden and brutal violence against religious communities, was not a new or rare event in the Ottoman Empire. Far forward, it was part of a long, dark pattern, a cruel thread woven tightly through many centuries of history, a recurring nightmare. It was a terrible practice, a policy of suppression that had taken place again and again across different regions and generations. This pattern of oppression and systemic violence began its most intense and horrifying phase in the year 1453. That was the year when the powerful Ottoman Turks successfully captured Constantinople, a city that had been the heart of Christian faith and a symbol of Eastern Christianity for over 1,000 years. This dark period of persecution continued right up until 1924, a span of nearly 5 centuries of sustained terror and hardship. During these hundreds of years, something truly terrible and deeply tragic happened to the Christian people who lived in this land, a land now firmly under Ottoman rule. Their numbers, once strong, vibrant, and significant, shrank in a horrifying and unnatural way. They went from making up a significant 20% of all the people living in the vast empire to becoming just a tiny, struggling 2%, a mere fraction of their former selves. This massive and sudden change, this drastic reduction in population, was not a natural event, not a simple demographic shift. It was not simply people choosing to move away or quietly deciding to change their religion by themselves without any pressure or fear. No, this dramatic and swift shift was the direct result of something much darker, much more deliberate, and undeniably cruel. This was a planned removal, a terrifying and dark secret of the Ottoman Empire, a policy of deliberate ethnic cleansing. It was carried out carefully, slowly, and brutally over many, many generations. But the question remains, even after all this time and all this suffering, why did this powerful and vast empire, with its many goals and ambitions, focus its terror so strongly on women of God? Why were nuns, in particular, these devoted spiritual leaders, subjected to such incredibly terrible, shocking, and deeply personal acts of violence and degradation? What made them such a specific target? The targeting of religious figures was broad and widespread, affecting many. Nuns, along with monks and priests, all religious leaders, were constantly living in extreme danger, their lives under a permanent shadow of threat. They faced threats to their lives and their freedom every single day, never knowing if they would see another dawn. Yet many reports and official records from that time show a disturbing and consistent truth. They show that nuns, more often than any other group, faced the absolute worst and most brutal treatment. They suffered truly brutal and shocking violence, acts that were designed not just to hurt them physically, but to completely break their spirit, to utterly destroy them from the inside out, leaving them hollow. The psychological torment was as severe as the physical pain, if not more so. Under the strict and often unfair laws of the Ottoman Empire, Christians were not seen as equal citizens, not valued the same way. They were viewed as inferior, lesser people compared to Muslims, living under a constant cloud of discrimination. They were given a special name, dhimmis, which meant they had far fewer rights and protections than Muslims, legally marginalized. Their lives were simply not valued in the same way. Their existence was considered less important. The law itself placed a lower worth on their existence, a legal devaluation. For example, if a Christian woman spoke in court, her word, her testimony, held much less weight and importance than the word of a Muslim man, a stark example of deep legal inequality. This meant that if a terrible crime was committed against a Christian woman, it was incredibly difficult, almost impossible, for her to get true justice. The legal system itself was built against her, designed to deny her protection and any recourse. She had almost no way to defend herself or seek punishment for those who wronged her, leaving her utterly vulnerable and exposed. European reports from that time, written by diplomats, missionaries, and travelers, painted an incredibly chilling and consistent picture. These reports showed that for decades, almost no Muslim men were ever punished for serious crimes committed against Christian women. These crimes included things like raping, kidnapping, or holding Christian women as slaves, acts that went unpunished. These horrifying acts often went completely unpunished, the perpetrators walking free without consequence. This terrible reality made Christian women, especially those in vulnerable positions like nuns, extremely exposed and without any real protection. They lived in constant fear, knowing the law offered them little to no safety, no shield against abuse. This terrible lack of justice was not just random cruelty, it was a deadly and very clever strategy. It was a way for the empire to show its immense power and total control over the Christian population, a brutal demonstration of dominance. It deliberately created a world where Christian women, and especially nuns, lived in constant, paralyzing fear, a fear that seeped into their very bones. They knew deep down that there was little to protect them, no real shield against the horrors that could befall them at any moment. Nuns were not just women who spent their days praying in quiet devotion within their monastery walls. They were the very heart and soul of Christian society, vital to their communities. Their roles were vital and deeply respected, far beyond just spiritual guidance. They ran schools, providing education and hope to countless children, shaping young minds and preserving knowledge. They were skilled healers, caring for the sick and the suffering in their communities. Often, without asking for anything in return, driven by compassion. They were also moral guides, wise women who showed people how to live good, honorable lives according to their faith, offering comfort, spiritual direction, and a beacon of hope in dark times. Their influence was widespread and deeply felt. Therefore, breaking these women, destroying their spirit and their standing in the community, meant much more than just hurting individuals. It meant breaking entire communities, tearing apart the very fabric of their existence. It meant tearing apart the social fabric, the very foundations of Christian life and hope, weakening them from the inside out. The Ottoman Empire understood this very well, with a cold, calculated insight into human nature. They knew that if they could destroy the nuns, if they could crush their spirit and desecrate their holy status, they could shatter the hope, the strength, and the entire structure of Christian life in the lands they controlled. It was a targeted strike at the core of a people's identity, a direct assault on their spiritual and cultural heart. Ottoman officials, with a chilling level of care and precision, kept very detailed records of Christian monasteries and convents. They knew exactly how many nuns lived in each sacred place, their names, and perhaps even their ages, treating them as inventory. They knew what valuable things the monasteries owned, down to the last precious item, every asset catalogued. These precise, carefully kept files were not just for collecting taxes, though that was certainly a part of their administrative function. They served a much darker, more sinister purpose. They helped plan future attacks, making sure these attacks would cause the most pain, the most damage, and the deepest despair possible. These carefully planned operations were efficient, utterly cruel, and terrifyingly effective. Then, when the timing was judged to be exactly right, when the political climate or military advantage was optimal, the soldiers would come. They arrived with a frightening predictability, following a dark and specific procedure that had been honed over years of practice. The convent, the home of these holy women, would be completely surrounded, sealed off from the outside world. Every possible escape route was cut off, leaving the nuns trapped inside, with nowhere to run. The terrified nuns, their hearts pounding with fear, their minds racing with dread, were then gathered together. They were often brutally forced out into the open, into the monastery courtyard or a public space, exposed and vulnerable. There, under the harsh, mocking gaze of their captors, they were sorted, much like objects or animals might be separated, their humanity denied. The older nuns, those whose bodies were not strong enough to work hard, or those who were past the age of bearing children, were often killed on the spot. Their lives were ended brutally, without mercy, their faith ignored, their elderly bodies discarded. This act was swift, shocking, and meant to instill extreme terror in the others, a stark warning of their fate. But the younger women, those with more years ahead of them, faced an even slower, more agonizing fate. A fate that was arguably more terrible than death itself, a living death of soul and spirit. Their sacred religious clothes, the simple robes and veils that were powerful symbols of their deep devotion and sacred vows, were violently ripped from their bodies. This was an act of extreme desecration, a public defilement. Their heads were then shaved, every strand of hair brutally removed, leaving their scalps bare and exposed. This was a painful act of public humiliation, meant to strip them of their identity, their beauty, and their femininity, leaving them feeling naked and utterly exposed. It was a physical and symbolic erasure of who they were, a forceful transformation. Their Christian names, the names given to them lovingly at birth, and confirmed in their baptism were cruelly taken away, replaced by new labels. They were then forced to use new Turkish names, names they did not choose, names that severed their connection to their past and their heritage. They were also forced to take part in Islamic rituals, often combined with terrible sexual violence, adding another layer of trauma, pain, and desecration to their ordeal. The goal of these horrifying acts was not just to convert them to Islam, although that was often a consequence and a desired outcome. It was much deeper, much darker than simply changing their religion from one faith to another. The true goal was to utterly destroy who they were, every single part of their identity, down to their very core. It was about wiping away their past, their deeply held faith, their personal history, and their very self, completely and utterly. It was an attempt to erase their humanity, leaving behind only an empty vessel to be used, to be controlled, and to be exploited for the empire's purposes. This was total subjugation. In the bustling big cities across the vast empire, special centers were built. These grim, terrible places were specifically designed to process captured Christian women, treating them no better than livestock or goods being prepared for market. In these centers, their humanity was systematically stripped away in every possible manner, leaving them broken. These women were measured, their heights and builds recorded, every physical detail noted down by their captors. They were weighed, their physical forms assessed like property, their bodies reduced to mere statistics. Then, with chilling coldness and detached calculation, they were given a monetary value, a price tag, placed on their heads. Their entire future, every single possibility, was decided solely based on how they could serve the empire's needs, often as slaves or as concubines in rich households. Perhaps the most horrifying and deeply disturbing part of this systematic cruelty was what happened next. Many captured nuns, women who had dedicated their entire lives to purity, celibacy, and unwavering devotion to God, were brutally forced to become pregnant. The chilling, unspeakable purpose behind this was to create slave children for the empire, new generations of servitude. This was an empire that was not just conquering vast lands and mighty kingdoms, it was conquering human beings themselves. It turned people into property, managing their lives, their bodies, and their destinies with a chilling and utterly terrible efficiency. It was, in essence, a production line of despair, creating new generations of servitude, of stolen lives. The immense public shame inflicted upon these nuns was a powerful and cruel weapon designed to break the spirit of the entire community. When nearby Christian villagers witnessed this horror, when they saw the utter destruction and desecration of their holiest men, they often lost. The message sent by these atrocities was terrifyingly clear and deeply chilling. If even God's most devoted and sacred servants were not safe from such horrors, then no one, absolutely no one, was truly safe. Fear spread through the communities like a terrible, fast-moving disease, paralyzing people and making them easier to control, easier to conquer, easier to exploit. European diplomats at the time, representatives from various nations, observed these terrible events with a mix of shock and helplessness. Though their warnings and reports were often ignored by their own governments, who prioritized trade and political stability, they confirmed that these atrocities were not rare or isolated incidents. They reported that nuns were repeatedly raped, kidnapped, and that monasteries were frequently looted and destroyed. These were common and expected acts of terror, a regular part of the empire's brutal methods of control and subjugation. Behind all this calculated cruelty, there was another very powerful driving force: money, pure and simple profit. Nuns, because of their perceived purity, their often better education, and their generally healthy physical state, fetched very high prices in the slave markets. They were seen as exceptionally valuable commodities, worth a great deal of profit to their captors. Raids on monasteries and Christian villages therefore became incredibly profitable ventures, a lucrative business for the empire and its soldiers. This profit, in turn, fueled more raids, creating a cruel and never-ending cycle of violence and exploitation, a self-sustaining system of misery. More raids meant more captives, more women turned into slaves, and ultimately more money flowing into the hands of the raiders and the empire itself. Abuse in this system truly became an industry, a source of immense wealth. Old city excavations in former Ottoman territories have uncovered buildings with strange and disturbing features, structures that speak of hidden horrors. These structures were not like normal homes or shops. They were built for a different, darker purpose. They had very narrow rooms designed to hold many people in cramped, suffocating conditions, with barely enough space to breathe. They featured deep drains, likely for sanitation in overcrowded spaces, and heavy chains built directly into the thick stone walls, clear signs of imprisonment. These were not just simple prisons. They were much more sinister, far more terrifying. They were human processing centers, places where people were systematically broken down, stripped of their identity, and prepared for the harsh, dehumanizing life of slavery. They were places of terror and profound suffering, where hope itself came to die, leaving indelible marks on history. What truly happened within these dark, confined places shattered countless souls and reshaped entire generations, leaving a permanent stain. It left scars that ran far deeper than any physical wound. Invisible wounds that affected families and entire communities for centuries to come, haunting their descendants. The horror was systemic, deeply ingrained, and its impact was vast, long-lasting, and truly devastating. Forced conversions were often carried out in public, like a terrible, humiliating show designed to demoralize. The goal was not just to humiliate the person being forced to convert, but also to deeply shame and demoralize their entire community, to break their collective spirit. Nuns, in front of their grieving families and neighbors, were sometimes forced to spit on their own crosses, a sacred symbol of their faith, an act of ultimate betrayal. They were also made to burn their own precious prayer books, destroying their spiritual connection and their link to God. Those who bravely resisted these terrible acts, those who held on to their faith with courage, were often severely tortured. They suffered immense physical and psychological pain, inflicted with calculated cruelty. But surprisingly, they were rarely killed. There was a cold, calculating reason for this lack of ultimate demise: a pragmatic evil. A dead captive had no market value. They could not be sold or exploited for profit or labor. A living, suffering captive, however, even one who was tortured and broken, could still be sold for profit or used for forced labor or forced to give birth, creating more slaves for the empire. Their suffering itself became a powerful tool of control and a constant source of profit, a truly horrifying economic model built on human misery. Ottoman religious leaders, in some instances, even claimed that sexual attacks on Christian women were a sign of Islam's victory and dominance over its enemies. They twisted religious teachings and beliefs to justify unimaginable cruelty, to legitimize their heinous actions. This further cemented the idea that these women were nothing more than spoils of war, property to be used as conquerors wished, their dignity completely erased. The breeding compounds, these terrible and soulless facilities, became factories of despair, creating new lives for the sole purpose of servitude. Here, the women's only purpose, their only reason for existence, was to reproduce, to bear children for the empire. They were forced to create more children for the empire, stripping them of all human dignity and personal value, reducing them to mere biological functions. Their humanity was brutally stripped away, leaving only their biological function. Their children, once born into this cruel system, were immediately taken away from them at birth without a moment's hesitation. The agonizing separation was instant and total, tearing families apart before they could even form. Boys were often raised to become elite soldiers, known as janissaries, serving the very empire that had enslaved their mothers and their grandmothers, a twisted fate. Girls were taken for forced servitude, to be household servants, or were kept for future breeding, continuing the cruel and dehumanizing cycle of forced reproduction. This cruel and absolute separation of mothers and their innocent children completely crushed their spirit, leaving them utterly desolate. It made them utterly dependent on their captors, with no family left, no past to remember, and absolutely no hope of escape or reunion with their loved ones. Their very identity was stolen from them, right at birth, their future predetermined by a brutal system. By the late 1800s, this system of human trafficking and forced conversion was a well-oiled machine, operating with chilling efficiency. It was incredibly efficient and widespread, reaching across vast territories. There were established trade routes across vast distances, with ships sailing seas and caravans moving across deserts, all specifically used for the transport of human beings as cargo, as valuable goods. It was an organized, large-scale industry of human misery and exploitation, a dark chapter in history. The empire, in its relentless expansion, wasn't just conquering new lands and seizing vast territories. It was conquering lives, seizing human souls. It was rewriting destinies, disconnecting people completely from their ancestral faith, their cultural roots, and their true heritage. It was forever shaping the future of generations in its brutal service, determining their purpose. It was a terrifying, and laws within the Ottoman Empire specifically stated that a Muslim man had total and absolute rights over his female captives, treating them as personal property. This meant that sexual violence, when committed against these enslaved women, was not considered a crime within this legal framework. It was simply not punished. Instead, such acts were simply seen as an owner exercising his accepted property rights over his human possessions, a legal justification for abuse. The law itself provided no protection, instead justifying the abuse and dehumanization of countless women. The empire kept meticulous, precise records of everything, a testament to its highly organized cruelty. Nuns, along with other captured Christians, were listed in official ledgers right alongside goods like valuable spices, fine silk, and other merchandise. This shocking detail shows just how normal, how accepted, and how deeply ingrained this horror had become within the system of the Ottoman Empire, an everyday business. Nuns, who were captured and enslaved, were often told cruel lies, designed to crush their spirit entirely. They were told that their families were dead, their homes completely destroyed, and their religion utterly erased from the world. This was a deliberate and calculated psychological tactic. It was meant to crush any remaining glimmer of hope they might have, making resistance seem utterly impossible, and any thought of escape a foolish dream, a futile fantasy. Over many generations, countless enslaved Christians were born directly into this brutal system, never knowing freedom or their true heritage. They grew up completely disconnected from their ancestral faith, their cultural roots, and their true heritage, their identities stolen. They were forced into servitude, serving the very empire that had brutalized their mothers and grandmothers, robbing them of their past and predetermining their future, sealing their fate. Escaped nuns who were caught trying to flee faced truly terrible and extreme punishments designed to be a brutal deterrent. They could be mutilated, their bodies scarred for life as a permanent mark of their attempt to regain freedom, a visible warning to others. They could also be subjected to unimaginable horrors, such as being buried alive in deep stone pits, a slow, agonizing, and terrifying death that served as a public example. These extreme measures were meant to deter any further escape attempts, sending a chilling message to all other captives, a message of absolute control. They were designed to instill absolute, paralyzing fear, ensuring compliance through terror and brutal force, crushing any thought of defiance. This was not just a series of random, cruel acts carried out by individual soldiers during wartime, isolated incidents of violence. This was a systematic, highly organized, and deeply ingrained policy. Yet, despite all the powerful efforts to suppress it, to bury it completely and permanently, the undeniable evidence remains. Old diplomatic reports, written by eyewitnesses, letters penned by brave missionaries, and the haunting, silent ruins of destroyed convents. Even ongoing archaeological digs continue to uncover subtle, chilling hints of this dark and long-forgotten past, whispers from the grave. Many modern stories and historical accounts of the Ottoman Empire often overlook this terrible human cost, this immense suffering. They tend to celebrate its grandeur, its impressive buildings, its beautiful art, and its great achievements, focusing only on its glories and triumphs. They often forget, or choose to ignore, the immense suffering and the systematic dehumanization that underpinned much of its power and wealth, a foundation built on pain. Remember that young nun, whose peaceful world ended in mere minutes, her life irrevocably altered. She was not just a statistic, not just a nameless victim in a dry historical record. She was a person, a vibrant human being with her own hopes, her own dreams, her own profound fears, and a deep spiritual life. Her entire humanity was swallowed whole by a merciless system of terror and exploitation, leaving her utterly broken. Behind every shining dome, every intricate tile, and every golden tower of the empire, there are the silent screams of countless women. Their voices were taken, their lives were shattered, and their stories were intentionally suppressed, never to be heard. Their harrowing experiences, their profound suffering, still wait patiently to be truly heard and acknowledged by the world, for their truth to finally be known. The empire's darkest secret, a secret of immense human cost and systemic brutality, waits for us to finally speak its name. It waits for us to acknowledge the full, terrible truth of what happened, and to remember those who suffered beyond imagination, those whose lives were stolen. This was not just random cruelty, it was a calculated and deliberate system of power, control, and dehumanization on a vast, devastating scale. If this story has shocked you, if it has opened your eyes to a forgotten truth that needs to be brought into the light, please help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe to the channel now And tell me in the comments which other hidden historical truth you want uncovered next, which forgotten story we should explore. Let's make sure these vital stories, these voices from the past, are never, ever forgotten again.